I have spent the last several hours going through the raw operational data, the diplomatic cables leaking out of Islamabad, and the real-time maritime traffic feeds from the Strait of Hormuz. And I need to tell you something that every mainstream network is completely burying right now. While the White House press pool is busy writing soft-focus headlines about Donald Trump saying a deal with Iran is very possible, Israeli F-35s were already wheels up and inbound to Beirut. Israeli forces struck Beirut's southern suburbs in what marks the first attack near the Lebanese capital since a U.S.-brokered ceasefire came into force last month. Think about what that means strategically. The United States is simultaneously conducting the most sensitive nuclear and war termination diplomacy with Tehran in decades, and its primary regional proxy just dropped ordnance inside a capital city that the ceasefire was explicitly designed to protect. This is not a tactical hiccup. This is not a rogue field commander making a unilateral call. This is a deliberate, calculated signal. And the target was not just a building in Harat Reich. The target was the ceasefire architecture itself. Here's what no one in the Beltway commentariat is saying. The Lebanon ceasefire has underpinned the broader U.S.-Iran truce. A halt to Israeli strikes in Lebanon was a key Iranian demand. So when Israel puts a precision munition into Beirut's southern suburbs while Iran's foreign ministry is literally sitting in a room in Tehran reviewing the American peace proposal, Israel is not conducting counterterrorism. Israel is conducting diplomacy with bombs. And the message it is sending to Tehran is unambiguous. No deal Washington signs on your behalf will protect you or your proxies. What I'm looking at right now is not a ceasefire under strain. What I'm looking at is the methodical, intentional demolition of a diplomatic framework, executed with kinetic precision, while the American president publicly celebrates its existence. The divergence between Washington's stated policy and Israel's operational reality on the ground is now a chasm, and that chasm has a direct, measurable cost, one that will land in your fuel tank, your grocery bill, and your investment portfolio. Let me walk you through exactly how this is playing out. To understand why the renewed Israeli strikes on Beirut represent a structural catastrophe rather than a manageable escalation, you have to understand the geography and the physics of this theater, because the terrain itself makes every Western diplomatic assumption fragile. Beirut sits at the western terminus of a corridor that runs from the Bekaa Valley through Syria and ultimately connects back to Iranian logistics networks. Hezbollah does not exist as a conventional army with fixed bases that can simply be attrited by air power. It operates as a distributed, cellular force in depth across an urban and mountainous landscape that has frustrated conventional military doctrine for 5 decades. The Radwan Force, the unit whose commander Israel claims it eliminated in this strike, is Hezbollah's elite light infantry component, trained specifically for cross-border infiltration and close-quarters urban warfare. Israel said it targeted a commander of Hezbollah's elite Radwan forces in the city's southern suburbs. Taking out one commander in a decentralized organization does not degrade capability. It triggers succession, hardens resolve, and, critically, provides Hezbollah the propaganda pretext it needs to justify retaliatory escalation within the ceasefire zone. Now zoom out further to the maritime dimension, because Lebanon is only one vector in a multi-theater conflict that has already fundamentally broken the global energy system. The Strait of Hormuz, a choke point measuring just 21 nautical miles at its narrowest point between Iran and Oman, is the single most consequential maritime passage on Earth. Until the outbreak of hostilities, approximately 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas transited this corridor. Iran's decision to close the strait in early March 2026 was not impulsive. It was doctrine. Iranian strategic thinking, rooted in the concept of asymmetric deterrence developed over 4 decades since the Iran-Iraq War, specifically identified the Strait of Hormuz as the instrument by which Tehran could impose disproportionate economic pain on adversaries that hold overwhelming conventional military advantages. The logic is elegant in its brutality. You cannot bomb your way past a closed choke point when the entity closing it is willing to absorb strikes indefinitely. Every B-2 sortie, every Tomahawk salvo, every CENTCOM press briefing about Iranian naval assets destroyed. None of it reopened the strait because the closure was never purely military. It was cognitive and economic. The goal was to make the cost of continued conflict prohibitive for Western economies before Iranian society collapsed. Israeli forces have been carrying out daily airstrikes deeper inside Lebanon despite the U.S.-brokered ceasefire, signaling a widening of the conflict beyond the country's south. Meanwhile, Hezbollah says its fighters have carried out targeted strikes against Israeli forces inside Lebanese territory, accusing Israel of repeatedly violating the ceasefire terms. This is the operational reality that Western doctrine cannot accommodate, a theater where the aggressor is also nominally the guarantor of the peace, where the ceasefire boundary is defined not by neutral arbitration, but by the military reach of the party that violated it, and where every Israeli airstrike on Beirut is simultaneously a provocation against Iran, a test of American resolve, and a data point that Tehran uses to calibrate whether a negotiated settlement is worth pursuing at all. Traditional Western military doctrine, built on overwhelming force, defined front lines and escalation ladders with predictable rungs, has no playbook for this environment. And that institutional blind spot is costing the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars per quarter. Let's be clinical and methodical about what actually happened in the skies over Beirut and what it tells us about the larger strategic competition unfolding across this theater. The strike on Harat Reich was not improvised. Harat Reich is a densely populated neighborhood in Beirut's southern suburbs that has served as Hezbollah's administrative and organizational nerve center for decades. Israeli military planners maintain continuous electromagnetic and human intelligence coverage of this district. The decision to strike here, on this specific day, while American negotiators were waiting on Tehran's formal response to a U.S. peace proposal, was deliberate timing, not coincidental. The operational message was sequenced. Demonstrate that Israeli kinetic reach is unconstrained by American diplomatic timelines. The Israeli Defense Forces dubbed similar prior attacks Operation Eternal Darkness, deploying approximately 50 fighter jets of the Israeli Air Force and around 160 munitions, hitting targets in central Beirut without prior warning, including at least 5 different neighborhoods. The pattern established in April has now repeated. No warning, urban targeting, maximum psychological impact. From a pure targeting methodology standpoint, the IDF's approach in Lebanon reflects what military analysts call a leadership decapitation plus infrastructure suppression strategy. The objective is dual purpose: degrade Hezbollah's command and control architecture while simultaneously imposing enough civilian disruption that the Lebanese state is forced to demand Hezbollah stand down. The problem with this doctrine in this specific geography is that it has never worked in 40 years of application. Hezbollah's organizational resilience is structurally hardened against precisely this form of attrition. Hezbollah has been firing hundreds of rockets and drones at Israel since March 2nd, and the Lebanese militant group has strongly objected to the Israeli-Lebanese diplomatic contacts occurring at the ambassador level in Washington. Decapitation of a single Radwan force commander does not interrupt rocket production pipelines, does not degrade drone assembly networks, and does not demobilize the tens of thousands of trained fighters distributed across the Bekaa Valley and southern Lebanon. Now shift the analytical lens to the Iranian side of this equation. Tehran has watched Israel bomb Beirut during a ceasefire that Iran extracted as a core diplomatic concession. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said the U.S. peace proposal remains under review, and Tehran will convey its response to mediator Pakistan after finalizing its views. The operative question inside Iran's National Security Council right now is this: if the United States cannot or will not restrain Israel from striking Lebanese targets during a ceasefire, what guarantee does any Iran deal actually provide? The answer, from Tehran's strategic perspective, is none, and that calculation makes reaching a durable agreement exponentially harder. Simultaneously, Hezbollah's tactical posture is being forced into a corner. Since the ceasefire, Israeli troops have remained in areas south of the Litani River, with strikes continuing in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has responded by firing armed drones at Israeli soldiers inside Lebanese territory. This is not a ceasefire in any meaningful doctrinal sense. This is managed low-intensity conflict with a fragile political veneer, and the Beirut strike has now stripped that veneer away. Consider the force exchange mathematics. Israel is deploying advanced F-35I Adir multi-role fighters, fifth-generation platforms with unit costs exceeding $100 million apiece, equipped with precision-guided munitions, against a distributed non-state actor that funds its military operations at a fraction of that cost per engagement. This is the fundamental asymmetry that defines the modern Middle Eastern battlefield. A technologically and financially superior conventional force is being strategically stalemated by a distributed, ideologically motivated, operationally adaptive, irregular force. Every Israeli airstrike that fails to decisively degrade Hezbollah's operational capacity while generating international condemnation and inflaming Lebanese public opinion is, by definition, a net strategic loss, regardless of the tactical outcome of the specific engagement. The UN Secretary-General, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, and the leaders of France, the European Union, Canada, China, Turkey, and over 20 other nations have condemned the Israeli strikes. The United States government has notably remained silent. That silence is itself a strategic data point, and Tehran's negotiators have already registered it. American silence in the face of Israeli ceasefire violations communicates with more clarity than any diplomatic cable where Washington's real priorities lie, and it hands Iran's hardliners exactly the argument they need to resist any accommodation. Translate this military and diplomatic chaos into the language that actually governs global markets and household economics, and the picture is genuinely alarming. The Strait of Hormuz crisis, already the most severe maritime disruption in recorded history, was beginning to show the faintest early signals of potential de-escalation as Iran reviewed the American peace proposal. Those signals have now been functionally extinguished by the Beirut strike. Even after Iran and the United States announced a ceasefire on April 8th, ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remained far below pre-war levels. The reopening was always more announcement than operational reality. Real-time maritime traffic data shows vessel counts through Hormuz sometimes as low as 3 per day, compared to well over 120 to 140 transits under normal peacetime conditions. Tankers turn back, shipping lines refuse bookings, insurance markets remain structurally restrictive, not because of any single military event, but because the trust premium that underpins global maritime commerce has been permanently damaged. Now add the Beirut strikes into that calculus. Every bomb that falls on Lebanese soil during an active ceasefire period sends a risk recalibration signal through Lloyd's of London and the specialized war risk insurance markets that underpin global tanker operations. War risk insurance premiums for the Strait increased from 0.125% to between 0.2% and 0.4% of the ship insurance value per transit, representing an increase of $250,000 for very large oil tankers. Those premiums do not ease until the geopolitical risk profile eases, and a fresh Israeli airstrike on Beirut, executed in direct defiance of ceasefire terms, does the opposite of easing risk profiles. Goldman Sachs estimates that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and attacks on regional energy infrastructure have reduced global daily oil production by 14.5 million barrels. Brent crude has risen nearly 50% since the outbreak of hostilities and has not dropped below $100 per barrel for nearly 2 weeks. That is the price of the strategic vacuum created when the superpower guaranteeing the ceasefire cannot enforce it against its own client state. The Dallas Federal Reserve has modeled that if the oil supply disruption persists for 3 quarters, global real GDP growth could fall by 1.3 percentage points. That is not an abstract macroeconomic projection. That is the difference between expansion and contraction for economies already burdened by post-pandemic debt loads and residual inflation pressures. The fertilizer transmission mechanism compounds the direct energy shock. Roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits the Strait of Hormuz, including large volumes of nitrogen exports. New Orleans urea prices have already risen from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton. And this is occurring precisely at the spring planting window for soy and corn in the American Midwest. Food inflation in the second and third quarters of 2026 is not a tail risk. It is a locked-in consequence of the current disruption, and the collapse of ceasefire confidence in Lebanon makes resolution of that disruption less likely, not more. UNCTAD has reported that Brent crude prices have now risen above $90 per barrel, with higher energy, fertilizer, and transport costs intensifying cost of living pressures, particularly for the most vulnerable populations globally. The private sector has already internalized this new reality. Shipping lines, traders, and financiers are no longer pricing risk based on stability. They are pricing based on structural volatility. The result is a system that permanently prioritizes resilience over efficiency, with cost structures rising accordingly. Globalization was engineered on the assumption of frictionless maritime choke points. That assumption is now obsolete. And the Israeli airstrike on Beirut today is one more confirmation that the era of reliable, low-friction global energy commerce is over. I'll be direct with you, because this is where the strategic picture becomes genuinely bleak, and I think you deserve an unvarnished assessment. Washington is now caught in a dilemma with no clean exit. Path 1. The United States publicly condemns Israel's Beirut strike, applies real diplomatic and material pressure to halt further ceasefire violations, and signals to Tehran that the American guarantee is worth something. This path gives the Iran deal a fighting chance. It might bring Brent crude back toward $85, stabilize war risk premiums, and begin restoring trust in Hormuz transit. The cost? A catastrophic rupture with the Netanyahu government, a domestic political firestorm in an already volatile American political environment, and the dismantling of the special relationship architecture that has defined U.S. Middle East policy for 75 years. Path 2. Washington maintains its silence. The ceasefire collapses in practice while surviving on paper. Iran's hardliners gain the upper hand in the internal debate over whether to accept any deal. The strait remains functionally closed. Oil stays above $100. Inflation accelerates into the American consumer's daily reality through fuel and food, and the United States absorbs the geopolitical cost of being the superpower that couldn't enforce its own ceasefire. Neither path is good. One is merely less catastrophic than the other. What's your assessment? Which path do you think Washington will actually choose, and which one should it choose? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments below. I read everyone. If you're watching this theater as closely as I am, subscribe and hit the bell. Tomorrow's briefing will cover exactly what Iran's response to the American proposal will look like and what the next 72 hours mean for oil markets. Don't miss it.